Hi everyone, great to have you all here with us today. My name's Francesca Porter and I'm the General Counsel at Onfido, a company who helps customers to verify their real identity in an increasingly digital world. I'm joined by Charlie Delingpole, the CEO of ComplyAdvantage, a lead company in AI-driven financial crime risk, detection data and insights. Hi Charlie.
Great to be here, Francesca.
Great to have you here. Thanks for joining us in the hot seat. We're going to spend some time today looking at how companies can adapt to fast-moving change in relation to sanctions and specifically customer screening. The Russian invasion of the Ukraine has resulted in the widest-reaching international financial and economic sanctions in history. For financial services businesses, it's become significantly more complex to stay compliant. Sanctions lists are changing daily, and the stakes are high for FS businesses who may be subject to multiple lists worldwide. Some of the learnings that we hope you'll take away from this session are around the current sanctions landscape and how it's expected to develop, how to evaluate, develop sanctions compliance and screening processes for customers, and best practices for sanction screening across existing and new customers. So Charlie, once again, thanks for being in the hot seat. I'm going to kick off with a first question around what the Russian invasion of Ukraine triggered and what it means for regulated industries.
Awesome to be here, Francesca, and thanks so much for taking the time to chat. Obviously, front page news for the past month or so, since February 24th, every fintech or bank CEO is going to their compliance team and asking about the consequences of the invasion for their business. We haven't seen this much change and complexity for regulated businesses in many years. So really, it is the showtime for sanctions and money laundering compliance. What are the consequences for regulated industries? Firstly, I think what we've seen is the largest numbers of sanctions issued in recent memory. So every single jurisdiction, every single regime has sanctioned a huge range of companies and people close to the regime. We've seen different geographic areas that have been sanctioned. So after the 2014 invasion, companies were banned from doing business in the Crimea. But obviously now, with Russia taking huge swathes of southern Ukraine and retreating from the Kiev area, there are huge areas now which are under illegal occupation by Russia. We've seen all kinds of entities sanctioned by numerous different regimes like Switzerland and Japan that previously held off on major sanctions. We've seen huge numbers of banks, huge numbers of paramilitary groups, propagandists, relatives of known associates of key Russian regime members. Obviously, the whole of Belarus has been involved in the invasion of Ukraine, so allies of the Lukashenko regime in Belarus. So the biggest change in sanctions in recent memory. And then also, it isn't just entities like people and companies that have been subject to sanctions. It's also been a wide-ranging bottom-up area of sanctions whereby Wimbledon in a few weeks has banned all Russian players. There's been theatres and cultural groups and orchestras that have been banned, and that isn't by statutory instrument. That's consumers and individuals demanding that brands and companies withdraw. So there's also linked to that all the different supply chain areas. So there's different companies that manufacture tanks or drones. Those can no longer import Western components. So for regulated industries, and that means most of industry generally, not just finance companies, huge lessons to take on board.
I actually think we've got a diagram or a graph that shows this really well on the next slide, where we can see this huge spike in the number of new sanctions that have come out this year. Sort of that looks very much at the customers, which we're going to focus on in this session. But for businesses to really hit where it hurts, I know there's also an export on a ban on luxury goods in various different regimes like the EU, the UK, and the US. With Europe looking at a de minimis threshold of €300, the UK focusing on high-end fashion goods and vehicles, perfumes, watches, and works of art. So any organisation with business dealings related to Russia all Russian individuals or entities has to really carefully consider the impact of these sanctions and export controls and what they might have in terms of exposure for their business, particularly as they change almost daily. And financial institutions also have to assess potential direct and indirect impacts of this complex web of measures by looking at effectively reviewing the adequacy of the internal controls and governance and adapting or enhancing systems and processes to ensure compliance. So, as mentioned, for this webinar, we're going to focus on named individuals subject to sanction regimes. And Charlie, at the named individual level, there are many sanctions lists. So we've got OFAC in the US, we've got the EU and the UK with their own versions. So for a company with a direct or even indirect presence in multiple countries, whether by virtue of an office or a branch or a sales presence or possibly partnerships, how can they best identify which lists are relevant to their businesses?
Great question, Francesca, and one which we could discuss for hours given the complexity and dynamics involved. I think the key thing is that there's often a life cycle of entities as they become more and more high risk. So the entities that are now sanctioned, like key propagandists or defense ministers or people who run paramilitary groups, those are well-known people who have been in the vanguard of the invasion and have been in headlines for years in the past, and therefore it's no surprise that they're now subject to sanctions. Those entities and those people and companies would have been subject to adverse media years ago. They would have been involved in corruption scandals, bribery, violent crime, fraud. Lots of them would have had adverse media which we should have known about years ago. Often they would have been holders of political office. They would have been governors of regional provinces like Roman Abramovich. They would have been relatives of Vladimir Putin, and therefore they could have been used as a vehicle to launder Putin's money. And only after that point, when they've been involved in all this corruption, bribery, fraud, or simply transgressing geopolitical risks in terms of violating the territorial integrity of various countries, are they then sanctioned. So as a company, are you happy to do business and be a conduit for someone who's involved in this in war crimes? So it's not only the court of law, but also the court of public opinion. You have to justify this, as in, if there was a Daily Mail headline tomorrow about your company being involved in channeling funds to someone linked to the regime, then your customers would probably be not particularly forgiving. And then in terms of the financial impact, in terms of fines, really it's critical that you aren't fined by the US Treasury or by any of the statutory bodies that were listed on the previous page. So, and also given the overlap between all those regimes, Putin is sanctioned by nearly all those regimes, the defense minister by most, but then often there'll be so much overlap that there isn't that much to choose between the regimes. So in reality, given how small the number of entities are, it makes sense really to comply with all of them, just so you're never wrong-footed and then have to exit a relationship. So it isn't really worth getting into business with these people, given the ramifications are so broad.
I suppose that you've touched on that, something that I think I'm really excited to talk a little bit more about on later, which is some of the practical solutions for businesses, because actually, you know, which lists do you look at if you do business in various different places and you're not quite sure which ones? Well, one of the practical solutions that we can hopefully touch on later is how to kind of work with a global provider, possibly providing these watch list services to help you identify individuals on these sanctions lists. But one of the next questions I had was, so we've had a look at some interesting graphs showing how the increase over the past few months in the number of sanctioned individuals has mapped, and it's sort of unprecedented, really. I'm really interested to know, because one of the quotes on the OFAC website, which I think is on the next slide actually, is around their SDN list. Now, how often are these sanctions lists updated? Because when I was doing a little bit of research before this webinar, I was looking at how frequently some of the lists they claimed that they were updated, and you can see here the SDN list is frequently updated. There's no predetermined timetable, but rather names are added or removed as necessary and appropriate. So that makes it quite hard, doesn't it, for businesses to track these changes. In practice, how often are we seeing these lists being updated in, for example, the EU, US, or UK?
So we can see from the chart previously how often the lists are updated, as in you had many days where you had 8 different jurisdictions updating the information, adding new entities. You had changes to law in the UK, which meant that it was possible for the UK to sanction entities with far less attention to the legal foundation for sanctions and being able to move a lot more fast around that. Often you see it being discussed in Parliament about whether Abramovich should be sanctioned. You see discussions in the press about whether or not relatives of Vladimir Putin should be sanctioned. So often it's in the press days, if not weeks beforehand, about the potential sanctioning of entities. And ideally, you don't want to be the last person holding the relationship. So it's better to kind of preemptively get ahead of the risk of sanctions rather than being notified by your counterparty that they've been sanctioned in any exit relationship. So the velocity and quantum of sanctions has increased to an entirely new pace, and therefore being able to work out which of your underlying clients have been sanctioned and then de-risk them as soon as possible has never been more challenging and more important.
And in terms of, it's quite an interesting point you just touched on, which is that, at what stage does something become a source of truth that you act on in terms of like a sanctions update? So, and I know that we had conversations before, Charlie, about how things can be mentioned in the House of Commons and they're not actually then reflected in the sort of the actual formal lists, or Boris might say something to a PR company which may not be reflected by updates in the law and so on. How do you think businesses should navigate this, and what should they rely on, or what companies that they partner with in terms of sources? How should they decide what the source of truth is, and when to act on it? And you've mentioned not being the last to do something, but I suppose there's also this kind of question about not acting on something which is a whisper on the wind or potentially not concrete enough to take action on too.
So in terms of the regulatory guidance around how often a financial services business must recheck their underlying user base against sanctions, I'd say it's good to ideally recheck their user base every 24 hours and ideally partner with a global sanction list provider who can provide single consolidated profiles of entities linking to the relatives and close associates, be able to understand the adverse media around them, all the political links, all the graph connections to those associates around them. So, and ideally allow them to remediate as fast as possible any potential matches, and also have the integrated name matching algorithms based upon the different languages involved, different ethnicities, to really balance the huge volume of false positives, false negatives. Many global financial services teams will have hundreds, if not thousands, of analysts working these results, and therefore a very small improvement in the underlying data can yield huge benefits in terms of the risks identified, and also the underlying workload that those people have to do. So the quality of data provided is really critical. And in terms of the frequency of checking, ideally every 24 hours, but different companies have different policies there.
Yeah, and it's totally risk-based really for financial services businesses as well. So for those financial services businesses looking for a clear steer on precisely the time limit to refresh these checks on, maybe that not one size fits all, but it's very unlikely from what we're reading and hearing and seeing that just to screen someone on an account opening, for example, if you're a financial institution, is going to be enough anymore. And it's quite interesting, the point you mentioned, Charlie, around reading every 24 hours. And for those people sort of listening today, it is worth noting that that doesn't mean you're going to be inundated with kind of like reports coming in across your whole user base every 24 hours. you'd ideally configure this service with a partner so that you're effectively only being notified if somebody in your customer base has had a change of status. So all of this is happening in the background for you, keeping you compliant without having that noise on a sort of daily basis. And Charlie, one of the points that you mentioned was around false positives. So, and we've had discussions about this in advance, but when you're trying to keep out bad actors, it's a real balance, isn't it, in terms of actually identifying those bad actors and those sanctioned individuals, but not blocking out good actors by mistake. So reducing what we call, and what you mentioned before, is false positives. And just to sort of bring that to life a little bit, when it comes to doing a watch list check, usually the data points that you will be checking against are first name, last name, date of birth, and country. But it could be run on just first and last name and country. Although then what would happen is you might find lots of people with that same name in that country. And in that instance, you'll get something which is called a false positive. And you'll be blocking that person out of your service or passing that person on to manual team to further review to ensure that you are catching the bad actor or the sanctioned individual and not all the good actors with potentially similar names. And that comes at great expense, having users blocked off your service or manual teams. So Charlie, what are the best practices for reducing false positives on sanction screening?
Great question. And again, another question that we could go into for hours, given how critical this is and the importance in terms of the operational impact of it. So as you said, having a first name, last name, it sounds simple, but many companies don't have that. Or they have data where they've got the husband or wife of the person involved, or they haven't got date of birth. So I think just having the basic data sounds simple, but in fact is a huge challenge for many companies. And then what you have is a kind of bridge whereby you have the match rate and the false positive rate at the start, and then there are various weapons in your arsenal or levers you can pull to reduce that from, say, a 20% match rate down to a 1% match rate. And those could be, for instance, as you said, filtering by country. They could be using different name matching techniques. For instance, if you're screening against Chinese names, you could say, I want to apply a 0 edit distance. If you want to filter by different crime types, so if you're filtering by adverse media, you want to a taxonomy that allows you to say that you don't care in this instance about environmental crime or violent crime. You only care about fraud. And then critically, the kind of
Sorry, I was going to say how interesting it is on the character types and how with the Chinese characters they can have so many different meanings and across the alphabet. And so you don't want to say we will take false, like incorrect spellings for that versus the Latin. I just wondered if you could touch on that point as well, because I find that quite interesting.
Yeah, so obviously, if you have a global client base, then you'll have Arabic names, Chinese names, Japanese names, Korean names, and each will have different conventions and algorithms that you can use. Specifically for Chinese, if you've got, say, a 3-character name and there are 50,000 permutations of characters, then that's different to a Latin name whereby you have 26 characters and, say, 20 characters in a surname and a first name. In Chinese, you don't want to use an edit distance. If someone calls me Charlie rather than Charles, then an edit distance of 2 will catch that and mean that my name is matched. Whereas in Chinese, if you got the different characters matching, then an edit distance will mean you basically match every name under the sun. So it's really critical to have those settings and those algorithms in place. Otherwise, it will generate huge amounts of work and mean that the real true positive hides amongst the false positives, and your compliance team find it impossible to deal with the backlog. So the edit distance, the matching algorithm, the country filter, the crime types, all these are really critical tools if you want to move from a 20% match rate to, say, a 1% match rate and have a chance of keeping up with the backlog of work.
And this is critically important to businesses. I mean, we hear from our customers all the time. They want to have manual teams set up to look at individuals who were rejected, a credit card or a new account opening or something similar, because their name has been picked up in a screening and incorrectly, for example, because those manual teams cost money, and that's a really bad user experience for those individuals who are trying to onboard and were not able to. And when you talk a little bit about how configurable some of these items are, I'm just interested to hear from your perspective how much you believe that sanction screening can be automated versus manual work.
So I think that the kind of interesting thing about screening and the data is that small improvements can have huge impacts in terms of the results, and therefore in terms of making sure that the data is up to date and you're able to track which of the 7 billion people and companies are linked to someone high risk, or being able to reduce by a small amount the irrelevant matches. All of these things, you really need a state-of-the-art system to be able to have those pieces of work come up accurately. It's very easy to produce a really bad set of results. It's like building Yahoo versus building Google in terms of to really invest in building something that's capable of delivering real results requires each different subcomponent to be perfectly engineered, and small things like, for instance, political exposure, the underlying political exposure screening. There are more PEPs than there are stars in the sky, as in when you look at one subcomponent of say South African PEPs, then more and more political exposure appears as you get more and more relatives, more and more close associates, more and more state-owned entities, and so therefore to really catch the risks and be able to disposition false positives by say having the dates of birth, all these things are really critical, and the only way really is to partner with a global provider who can have the scale, reach, technology to be able to invest in solving this problem. And
who can help you optimize those configurations by the sounds of it, because there's a huge amount of expert knowledge that goes into that. And
yeah, I think it's an ongoing optimization and iterative process to get the best results out. So in terms of what you're looking for in a watchlist vendor, there are probably 4 main things. I think firstly, the kind of coverage element. So you need to be able to cover all the entities, and you need to be able to keep that up to date. So it isn't just doing it once over. It's like painting the 4th bridge. As soon as you've finished, you have to start again with all the people who have changed their names, who have died, who have changed position. It's just a constant battle. Then in terms of the uptime, reliability, you need a kind of state-of-the-art robust system. You need underlying data that's very, very accurate, because there's nothing worse being an analyst than having data that's out of date once it's been interrogated. And then in terms of the different levers you can pull and the kind of bridge we spoke about earlier in terms of moving from a kind of low match rate to a high match rate, or if you're doing things like progressive onboarding and triaging your highest value clients into a EDD type scenario versus you want low friction with your low value clients, then I think the only commonality amongst all financial services clients is the degree of customization and configurability that they want. So every compliance officer is different. Everyone has different demands. Globally, regulations change so much, and people have such pressing needs that really it has to be so flexible. Otherwise, the frustration builds up, and the challenges just mount and mount. And therefore, that's why the kind of state-of-the-art functionality and these particular dimensions of it are so important to so many clients.
Thank you so much, Charlie. I think it's helpful to have those highly practical tips on how some of our customers can comply with the sort of speed of change, the volume of change that we're seeing at the moment. And I hope that some of the suggestions from Charlie today around what to look for in a potential watch list vendor will be helpful. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to drop us a LinkedIn. Thanks again, Charlie.
Thanks so much, Francesca.